Okay, hello folks. I'm sorry if there was a slight technical delay, which is natural in this day and age, I suppose. We're all getting used to it. Thank you very much to Dirk and the Whiskybase team for putting on this the tasting this evening. I think it looks like we're okay to go. Uh, I've already covered a little bit of ground, but just in case you weren't with me, didn't hear, um, obviously, thank you for the team for sorting that out. I hope everybody's up to speed as much as you can be in this day and age. I kind of hate some of the expressions that are used at the moment, these interesting times, etc., etc. But these are whiskey times, and that's a good thing because all of you have six fantastic whiskies in front of you to taste through this evening. And I'll run you through them. I'll just do a little bit of health and safety, just in case anybody needs to. The toilets around there, fire escapes over there. If you hear any heavy breathing, it's my girlfriend Cara, who's a German Shepherd dog, so don't worry about that. Um, and apart from that, we don't really have to worry too much. Uh, I figure you know that the layout of your own houses. If I turn my head and start looking at things, it's only just to check and see messages that are coming in from you, questions that you want to ask as we sort of flow through. So the format really is what I normally do in normal circumstances, which is to say thank you for coming, and then to tell you a little bit about me, a little bit about the history of Berry Brothers and Rudd, which should take about 4 hours, and then we'll dip into a little bit of how I taste whiskey and why I select the cask that I do for the company. And so I hope you're comfortable with that. At least you can run out your front door if you're not. So, little bit about me. The name is Doug McIver. Some of you might recognize me from various trips to the Netherlands and other countries around Europe, or maybe if you've come to visit Berry Brothers and Rudd in London. I got kicked out of Scotland when I was 11 years old for bad behavior. It was actually because my mother remarried a Londoner. So since the age of 11, I've actually lived in London, but my heart is still in Scotland. So every opportunity I get, I'm back north of the border to see remaining family, visit distilleries, grab as much culture, and drink as many good drams of malt whiskey as I possibly can as well. So I was educated in London. When I left college, I was very, very bored with the job that I was doing, which was in quality control. But it wasn't the right type of quality control. This was a carpet business, a major carpet business. And I decided at the age of 21 that there must be something else in life. So I joined the wine trade. And through the wine trade, I learned something about the nuances. I studied uh, qualifications in the trade, learned about the various regions around the world, etc. And then by accident, in 1990, I applied for a job with a retailer and wholesaler in the Soho district of London. That was called Milroy's. And I didn't really appreciate that at that point they already had a sort of a big reputation for whiskey. Half of the company was wine based, and half of the company was whiskey. Two brothers, John and Wallace Milroy. And it took me a while to sort of bed in there, but they were very generous gentlemen in terms of um, just the way that they were, and the information that they could give to me. And they were also very generous with the bottles that they would open. And a lot of the contacts, who were young men at the time, who are still lifelong friends of mine in the trade. And that's the thing I think I like the most about working in the wine and spirit trade, particularly the whiskey trade, because when you make friends, you tend to make friends for life, you know, and that goes from producer, master distillers to the customers that when we go out to various trade shows, and we pour our offering over the counter. That's really where we're found out. That's where you lovely people get the opportunity to say, yeah, this is good, Doug, but it's not as good as the last one. you know. So there's always that pressure, and it's it's a friendly trade in the sense that even though we're competing with other bottlers and major distillers around the world, we make friendships, and I think that's important, and that's one of the nice things about this trade. So I've now been at Berry Brothers for 18 years, and I'm still considered one of the new boys because a lot of the people that we have working in the company have been working there for over 30 years. And the company has a history dating back to 1698. So we think that we're actually the oldest wine and spirit merchant in the world. We certainly are in the UK. But the origins of the company go back to the days of a lady called the Widow Bourne, who founded the establishment in St James's Street, which is next to St James's Palace, and about sort of 3-4 minutes walk away from Buckingham Palace. So we're in the heart of the West End. Our cellars, if you added all of the square footage up, would equal, I think, the cellar master, who's still a friend of mine, now retired, worked for the company for 35 years, told me it was equivalent to a football pitch. But as a company, obviously, we outgrew that space, and we now have warehouses about 60 miles away from St James's, where we store 9 million bottles of wines and spirits, um, and a lot of that we do for sort of private customers, so you can hold your own cellar reserves, etc. We're very well known in the UK as fine wine merchants, but the story, I suppose, is a little bit different in a sense when it comes to spirits. Um, and really, obviously, this is a whiskey tasting, and I don't want to bore you for the full 4 hours. So I'll sort of cut into a little bit of the history of Berry Brothers, why we're situated where we are, and what we've lived through and become, and the sort of whiskey story that came with us down the years. Um, so as we started off as actually coffee merchants, and if you visit the store, you'll see outside the front door there's a sign hanging, the sign of the coffee mill, and not many people could read or write in London back in the early 1700s. We don't know too much about the widow Bourne who founded the store back in the day, but her descendants married into the Berry family, and then through through blood, we can actually trace back to 1698, and the business has been operating from the same premises since then. Obviously, we're kind of locked down at the moment, like everybody else, which is why I've had to sort of decamp to southeast London for a while. But I've got enough to keep me busy for a while, as well, as you can probably see from the shelves behind me. But the store, which is well known today for providing wines and spirits, even though it came from a base of selling things like coffee, tea, and spices. The building itself goes back to Tudor times, the times of Henry VIII, who was a famous king who had the six wives. Not all survived, and he didn't in the end either. But in those days, you would find that royal families didn't countenance smell very well. So they used to have various palaces that they could go to, pollute with their effluent because of the massive entourage that they had with them. And then they'd decamp to another palace. And if you were really unlucky, you'd be a friend of the king's. And he'd send a messenger to you and say, "Oh, well, I'm coming to visit you in 3 months' time." And effectively, that meant I better get building, you know. So even though it was a privilege to be a friend of the king, it came with a price. And Berry Brothers as a company, we've been fortunate to have associations with the royal family going back to the days of King George III. And even today, if you look at our labels, we carry two royal warrants on the label, one for Her Majesty the Queen, and the other one is for her son, the Prince of Wales. I think we're the only bottler that's able to do that, and it's a great privilege. And obviously, they're neighbours, which is great, you know. But it still carries the price. And our former chairman is the master of the royal cellars, so he looks after selection of the wines and spirits for any visiting dignitaries and banquets that go on in the royal palaces. Um, I think the first royal warrant we received was from King Edward VII in 1902. He was a real character, well known as a little bit of a philanderer, uh, a boy about town. And he came to Berry Brothers and asked us to create a liqueur. Well, actually, it was his physician. His doctor said the king's not too well. He needs something to keep him warm while he's been driven around in his new Daimler. He actually had two of them, um, and so we created a liqueur that we still produce today, and is very, very popular, called the King's Ginger Liqueur. Throughout all of the years since the foundation of Berry Brothers, the business evolved in numerous different ways. But I know that even at the end of the 1700s, the company was bottling brandy. And I found lists of old cognacs going back to the late 1700s, um, where Berry's brandy was featured, and that was really the mainstay of spirits in the business back in those days. Brandy and soda were the drink of the gentleman in London. You would drink beer as a staple, but if you could afford it, then you'd be happy to drink brandy because you had a more refined taste and obviously the money to pay for it. But a couple of things happened. The first thing was really the Napoleonic Wars, and supply was restricted for a number of years. Uh, so at the time, the London market started looking for something else, and the something else happened to be Scotch whisky. So we threw the border, and at the time, Scotch whisky was which produced lighter spirit and more volume that could be added to the single malt whiskies. So it became an affordable product, and also at the time, this is the Industrial Revolution. This is the time when railways were being built, and Britain was at the forefront of building railways. And they stretched to far-flung places in the Highlands. Some didn't. Some still needed a ferry boat to get to, and some were still producing spirit illicitly and not paying their taxes. So there came a time when, in the Central Belt, as we know it, which is a stretch of land between Edinburgh and Glasgow, the two main cities in Scotland, there was obviously a great ability to mass produce and make it readily available to the London markets and export, far beyond. And that's really where the industry grew. But the heartlands, and still is the heartland of whisky production, the Highlands of Scotland and the islands. And what should we do now? Should I drink a bit more of this lovely large measure that I poured myself, which is very cloudy? There's actually a bock beer from Germany that I used as a palate cleanser a few minutes ago. I suppose we ought to get into tasting a little bit of whiskey. You can shoot me through any messages, and I'm going to try to watch the other screen just to see if Dirk is sending me any messages, but I think you guys are fine and dandy at the moment. I could go on about the history of Berry Brothers and Rudd until we're all blue in the face, to be honest. So if you ever get the opportunity to come and visit us in London, or just check out Berry Brothers' website, you'll see a lot of information there, background on the history of the company, who we are. We have the same kind of ethos across the wine bars in the company and spirits bars, and that's that we only drink what we like drinking. We only bottle what we like drinking. So we got. Let's have a look. We got 3 different single malts tonight, even though 2 of them come from the same distillery, which you might find quite unusual, but I think that's interesting because you can compare whiskey from different casks and different sets of maturity, I suppose. And the first one we're going to try is a Glenburgie. And Glenburgie is a Speyside whiskey. This particular one, you should have a tasting sheet that came through that at least shows you the order we'll be tasting. So top left to bottom, then top right to bottom. This one's at 59.7%, so it's quite feisty. The way that I taste whiskey, I'm just going to pour some into my glass now. It doesn't make the sort of huge glugging sound that a full bottle will, but anyway, this is what it looks like. So quite pale in colour. Glenburgie's Speyside distillery that can trace its roots back to 1810. It wasn't really until around about 1829 that it was recognised as a distillery with a brand behind it. And at that point, the distillery was known as Kiln Flat. And it's near Forres, a little village called Alves in Speyside. And nowadays, the distillery is working well and prolifically, but in its early years, it sort of fell in and out of production. Even into the 1900s, there were periods where the distillery closed down. But some important things happened, and one was that the company that is now Ballantyne's um, needed a brand or some output from a distillery to go into a blended whiskey called Old Smuggler. And every single malt exists really because of the blends that Scotland were producing at the time. You know, blending something, the single malt distilleries would produce ingredients that were added to the blender's palette, much like an artist's palette, the way that you can sort of color in and create something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. So Old Smuggler was a popular brand that belonged to Hiram Walker, Canadian firm, who eventually changed into what we know as Allied Distillers and is now Pernod Ricard, French-owned company. And over the years, the distillery managed to up its capacity to keep track with the demand for the blend. And to me, it's a sort of classic mid-style whiskey in a sense. I can see from a blender's perspective uh, why it's an important ingredient because it has a little bit of everything to it. You know, it's got uh, some of the sort of honey strand notes that run through it, and but it's got character. It's got backbone. You know, there's obviously a lot of influence from the wood, which is important. That's what people are looking for. And I'm just going to check at the moment. Andre asked you, why are you starting with the cask strength whiskey and not 46%? Well, that's Andre. That's why I've got this stuff. My other friend, Highland Spring Water. Um, Probably off the back of that question, it's and before we get tasting, obviously all whiskies come out of the cask at cask strength, and cask strength can be anything. If you have a 30-year-old whiskey, sometimes it's dropped down to mid 40s in percentage. With younger whiskies like this one, this is 2008, so this is a 11-year-old. Obviously, the angels haven't taken too much of their share, and at the same time, the alcohol volume hasn't dropped as much. But what I love about cask strength whiskies is that they're very sort of true and honest, but I always will add a bit of spring water to them, which is why you should have some handy. If you don't, run to the kitchen, and even tap water is fine. I don't get on too well with London tap water because it's slightly sort of lime scaly, and I prefer using sort of Highland spring water, and I always keep some handy. Um, I suppose we run through sort of what I look for in a whiskey, and that'll take us into the elements of why water is important with it. You know, if you look at the whiskey, it's quite pale in colour, but it's a younger whiskey. What does it tell you? Not an awful lot, really. A lot of my favourite whiskies are actually pale in colour, uh, and that's because a lot of them have been matured in ex-bourbon barrels or refilled Scottish hogsheads. The darker whiskies tend to come from ex-sherry butts or puncheons. Uh, they've been seasoned with sherry before. Um, and that gives the colour. And a lot of whiskies nowadays, as we all know, they're finished. People put the original whiskey, into other casks uh, so that they take on different textures and nuances and different flavors from being re-racked into another type of wood. Always has to be oak, but it might have held sort of different types of wine before, Sauterne or even Bordeaux, and the the list is very sort of long in terms of what you can then really rack into. Over the terms of my career at Berry Brothers, we haven't actually done very much finishing. We're starting to move into that now a little bit more, just because the market is looking for different things. But my favourite type of cask is a refill hogshead, and that's a cask that's pretty neutral in a sense. If you leave the whiskey in there for long enough, eventually you're going to get a good balance of the distillery style, and the spirit itself, balanced with the wood. And I think that's magical because it can be very sort of nuanced and balanced. The three main things that I look for when I'm selecting from the samples drawn from the casks that we own or we want to buy. The first is the balance of the spirit. It needs to be balanced. So on the nose, even at cask strength, when I'm nosing something, it needs to not just be a sort of sheer hit of pure alcohol. There needs to be something going on there already. So it needs to sort of give out these sort of honey and nuts and fruit. And, depending on the part of Scotland it comes from, it could be phenols and, sort of smokiness. And even sometimes you get things like kippers. But as long as it's good kippers, which are smoked fish, then that's okay if it's in balance with the rest of the whiskey. And that's really what I'm looking for. Balance, complexity, lots of different things going on so that one thing is not over dominant when you nose and taste the whiskey. And then texture. It's really, really important to me. Texture of whiskey, because that's what carries it on the palate. And when you taste something, it then evaporates, goes into your olfactory senses. If you're lucky enough to have a very sort of small nose like me, a very sensitive, small Scottish nose, then basically the receptors are up here, and the business end is between your olfactory senses and a very thick Scottish skull. So the palate is one thing, but the texture will hold the spirit on the tongue, and you move it around various parts of your mouth, and each part of your mouth has a different concentration of sensors. So you can then really sort of get to experience all of the flavors, whether they're the salt, sweet, bitter, sour. The palate is good for detecting primary flavors, but it's your olfactory senses that actually deliver most of the information that computes to your brain that you like this whiskey or you don't like it, or you might have a preference for something else. So that's the way I kind of go about it. And I'm now going to put the wee drop of water in there. And when you add water, it changes the structure of a whiskey. And you can actually see a reaction sometimes when you pour a wee drop into your glass. You see a kind of swirl, which has been described famously by Bill Lumsden, who's the head of maturation and distilleries at Glenmorangie Ardbeg, and he says this is releasing the serpent, and that's what it does. There's a chemical reaction that goes on when you add the water, changes the structure of the whiskey, and it releases the aromatics. And this is important because it makes it far more approachable. And if, for example, it's still to you a little bit strong on the nose, then just put a wee bit more water in and it will soften and you'll become acclimatized to it, and the whiskey eventually becomes acclimatized to you. So this is Glenbergie, 11 years old, and it's a bonny dram. Um, I've said it's equally balanced. It's got a sort of slightly a dry edge to it on one side, but at the same time, there's a lot of sort of honey and sort of almost kind of lemon, citrus, and maybe a slightly sort of more uh, sharp citrus bite to it, lime-like in a sense. And the other thing that I say to you is, this, whatever I sort of write that goes on the tasting label on the back of a bottle, um, it's my impression, and I never try to sort of force my impression down anybody else's throat or tell them, this is what you should be tasting in a whiskey because we're all different. I've been tasting whiskey for obviously a long time, and I know what I like. I know what my preferences are, but yours might be entirely different to mine. So there's no point in trying to put too many suggestions into people's heads. We give you a rough guide, and then you guys are the experts because you're the people who buy the whiskey. And I'm just lucky enough to work in an industry that affords me the chance to talk to you and have a good dram now and again. So on the nose is obviously very, very important. It's probably the most important part of tasting a whiskey from my perspective, because that's where you'll find most of the faults in a whiskey. Um, a lot of the master distillers in Scotland who are working, round the clock in keeping uh, trademark blends like, sort of Bell's, Teachers, Johnny Walker, etc., um, alive and consistent. Uh, they have to produce the same product day in, day out, year in, year out. They're looking for consistency. I'm lucky I work in an industry and a small part of the industry as an independent bottler where you can get away with, sort of having different expressions. And whatever we produce, it doesn't have to, taste the same as the distillery product. That's just a luxury that we're given. We're not trying to create anything with consistency because the beauty is in the diversity of what we're able to offer. And obviously, there's beauty, of course, in producing masterpiece blends like Cutty Sark, which is part of Berry Brothers' heritage, and blends like Ballantine's, which this contributes to mainly nowadays, the Johnny Walkers, etc., which are masterpieces. And these guys they're sort of true artists with what they're able to do to balance the inventory of their stock and control it to be able to produce something that's consistent and consistently good. So anyway, I'm just looking to see if there's any more questions here. Ian O'Brien from Ireland asked, "Do you ever buy casts and then recast into your independently podcasts?" And I think I probably mentioned a little bit of that earlier. Yeah, we are recasting now. We're starting to experiment a little bit more, predominantly in sherry cask, but also because we're wine merchants, we do have access to sort of various wine casks from around the world. So we're starting to experiment, and even sometimes we'll swap over a whiskey into a rum cask, for example, and we'll swap the other way. So we put rum into whiskey casks, just to try and experiment and find different ways that we can produce something that's a little bit interesting, a wee bit different to anything that we've done before. There's a lot of this going on, and I say I'm a sort of purist in the sense that I like a whiskey that sort of stayed in the same cask all of its life and naturally got to the point where it's at. But at the same time, you get fed up eating fish and chips every night, so why not try something a bit different? And that's what we're doing now. So I don't know. I can't hear the feedback. Normally, at this point, after tasting the first whiskey, you'd all be standing up, giving me a round of applause. Um, you can do it online. Send me a nice message if I think it's time to sort of plow through a little bit. So if you haven't already, uh, then obviously go ahead, taste the whiskey. I'm not going to tell you what you should be tasting from it because you're all going to taste something different, you know. So I'm going to try a bit now, just to wash down that bock beer that I just had. I like to chew the whiskey around quite a bit. It's even for me, it's 59% alcohol. Even for me, it's still a little bit sort of on the powerful side with the alcohol. So I just added drop more water. That's better. It's bringing out to me a lot of sort of soft yellow fruits, that sort of thing. A little bit of melon skin, maybe some caramel notes. It's soft and gentle. Maybe banana skins, this kind of thing coming through. There's some nice sort of barley sugars that develop on the palate that sort of retain the sweetness, stop it from drying out. The finish slightly drier in a sense, but the fruit's very long in this, and it's an elegant whiskey. It's what I'd probably like to drink around about 4 o'clock in the afternoon after a round of golf, especially a bad round of golf, and I'm perfectly capable of that. I was once told that my golf was pretty much the same as archaeology, and it hasn't really moved on over the years. So flowery, sort of elegant, sort of hints of rose petal, bags more yellow fruit, just a sort of lovely, elegant, balanced whiskey. And when you get the balance of what you're pouring and the additional water right, you're going to do well. Right. Okay. I was clever. I've only got two lovely whiskey-based glasses that were sent through to me by Dirk with the tasting pack. Funny thing is, some of these whiskies I haven't actually tasted for a number of months, and sometimes you have to do a tasting, and you're tasting something that can go back years, and you reaffirm or change your opinion on something. Um, Very mixed bag in terms of the offering tonight, but number two, I've got to be conscious of time as well, um, because I can talk forever, and I know that eventually it will become Wednesday. So number two is Blue Hanger, and the history behind Blue Hanger goes back to the early 1930s when Berry Brothers were approached by the British diplomatic service. So it was the forerunners of James Bond and his pals, and they wanted a whiskey for themselves. So our blenders at the time came up with a high malt um, concentrated blended whiskey that was sold pretty much exclusively in diplomatic circles. And it sort of hung around as an afterthought because our main brand from the 1920s through to recent years was Cutty Sark. So Blue Hanger wasn't really an important part of. It wasn't being developed really as a blend, apart from something that was customer specific. And it had died out really by the time I joined Berry Brothers 18 years ago. But one night, it was about 6:30, 7 o'clock in the evening. I was still in the office and I was messing around with some samples that we had from old casks of Glen Grant and Glenlivet. And they were very nice on the nose and individual casks. They were, sort of some of them sensational. But I decided just to do a little blending exercise to see, what one of the Glen Grants would do with some of the Glenlivet. And I was blown away with the quality. And this was these casks. They were sort of minimum 25 years old. Some up to 35 years old. But I fell in love with what I'd put in front of myself, and decided, we need to bottle this. And we need a name for it. And of course, we had Blue Hanger as a brand sitting on the shelf, not doing anything. And this was the sort of rebirth of Blue Hanger as being a product that it wasn't based on a price point. It was just based on the quality of the liquid. And really, that's how Blue Hanger has sort of developed over the last few years. We release it in small batches. There's never really, I mean, it's grown to, per batch, 3,000 bottles, spread across, various casks and incarnations. The first three bottlings were all Glen Grant, Glenlivet, but we ran out of that stock. But there was still, I still had an interest in blending and trying to put together something that I could be proud of and the company could be proud of. So we carried on doing it. So this is the 11th release. We're actually up to number 13, but that went to Taiwan as an exclusive because 13 is not unlucky in Taiwan. We haven't done 12 yet. We're still working through the stocks of this one, number 11. And one of the good things when you create, sorry, I'm just going to have to check and make sure. People are curious what type of cask this was. Okay. So we're going back to Glenbergie. It was actually from a hogshead, a refill hogshead. Sorry for not explaining that, but it is my favorite type of cask. I also like refill bourbon barrels as well. I know there's a slight lag between messages coming in, so please be patient. But back to the Blue Hanger, and here's a printout that I made earlier. See, I still like to do everything old-fashioned ways, and because I'll probably get a question in a moment, what's in the Blue Hanger? So I'll read it out to you. There's a puncheon of 1990 Bunnahabhain. There's a hogshead of 2007 Bunnahabhain Moyne, which is a peated version of Bunnahabhain. There's a sherry butt of 2000 Glengoyne. And then there's one hogshead of Altmore 1997 and two hogsheads of Dalhuin 1998. So this was not what a blender would normally do, because you're using fairly old stock to put together a blend. There's an element of risk there. But as someone who blends, you can already have flavor pictures in your mind, so you can see sometimes what might work well with another cask. Um, when it's coming to more concentrated uh, or bigger volumes rather of blends, then you really need to do things on a spreadsheet, and that's where most blending starts. It starts on a spreadsheet. I spend forever going through spreadsheets, pulling casks together that in my mind I think might work, but there's no point in interrupting the casks or drawing samples unless you're confident that it'll hit a price point that is fit for the markets. But Blue Hanger wasn't really about that. Blue Hanger was about, it was me having a bit of fun initially, and it's sort of fairly expensive compared to things like Monkey Shoulder, for example, or other blended malts, some of the Compass Box whiskies. But it's trying to sort of put together flavors and balance that you wouldn't normally find in cheaper whiskies or blends that you buy. There's no grain whiskey in this. It's pure malt, as we used to call it. So it's all single malts. So have a look and see. You might already have finished it if you're sensible. And so there's a fair concentration of Islay whiskey in there, but it's only Bunnahabhain. And really, the Bunnahabhain in here, the Moyne, which is the younger of the two Bunnahabhains, is the one that's delivering these sort of peaty phenol notes that are coming through, slightly sort of tarry, tobacco-y notes. And the older Bunnahabhain in here is less peated, but that's the one that came from the sherry cask. And that's giving a little bit more in terms of sort of dried fruit notes, maybe some orange citrus, that kind of thing, to my mind, and maybe even elements of sort of nuttiness, a little bit of sort of walnutty creaminess, and maybe some other sort of things that remind you of sort of nut kernels, almond or something or other. But there's a complexity to this whiskey in my mind that you don't get from a single malt. And that's why I love experimenting and trying to, sort of just open myself to the world of blending. And sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't get it right, But Blue Hanger has been widely acclaimed as one of the best blended malt whiskies in the world on numerous occasions by various different publications. And you only get that feedback really from people who appreciate, the quality and what goes into creating something like this, which is artisan. It's something you won't find every day. Okay, we're about an hour in or so, and we've only managed to get through 2 whiskies so far. I could go back and tell you a little bit more about the history of Berry Brothers. That would take us up to midnight, and if you want to stay up with me until 1 o'clock, that's fine as well. But I have to go to work tomorrow. Okay. Love your feedback if you want to give it, of course. If not, fine by me as well. The next one is from Invergordon, which is a single grain distillery up in the northeast Highlands of Scotland, a place called the Black Isle. The Blue Hanger, by the way, you've probably got the sample in front of you, 45.6. We bottled Blue Hanger at 45.6 because it reflected the original bottlings, and it translated to an old sort of proof measure. And one of the things that is sort of curious and interesting about Berry Brothers is that we try not to fix something if it's not broken. People like it. I'm being told people like the Blue Hanger. It's very nicely balanced. Is the feedback so far. So thank you very much. Um, let's have a look at the Invergordon. As I said, it's a northeast. It's the only grain distillery in the Northeast Highlands or in the Highlands. Most of the grain plants were built in the central belt between uh, Edinburgh and Glasgow. Uh, and Invergordon was built primarily to produce spirit for a company called White and Mackay, who are still the owners, and they own the nearby single malt distillery Dalmore. And for a while, a few years, at Invergordon, they actually had pot stills in there as well. They produced a single malt called Ben Wyvis, which is very, very rare nowadays. You might occasionally come across independent bottlings of it. But the mainstay of Invergordon Distillery is producing grain spirit. I think they have nowadays 5 column stills as opposed to pot stills, and 4 of them are pumping out something like I don't know, 4 million litres of alcohol per annum, which isn't the biggest in terms of grain distillery output, but it's enough to suit the company purposes to go into White and Mackay, and we're lucky enough now and again to come across single casks, and this one was bought from the broking market a few years ago. We sat on it and bottled it in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, I think. Um, and I, I admire single grain whiskies as much as I do single malt whiskies. Uh, to me, the interesting thing about the grain whiskies is because the spirit, when it's filled into cask, is quite light uh, in terms of character. Um, it's more about the interaction with the wood as it matures. And most of the grain whiskies, they're matured for sort of 3, 4, 5 years, and then they go to contribute to the standard blends that we see, on the shelf, famous Grouses and Kelly Sarks and Bells, etc., etc. But if they're left in the wood for the right amount of time, then they'll start taking the nuances from the wood. They're actually very easily influenced by the wood because the spirit's quite light. But you get to a point where they start to become sort of superheroes. And this is 1988. This is actually older than me. I'm only kidding, just in case you're still watching or listening. We do actually in the company. We've got some 1964 grain whiskey, which is the year that I was born in. I'm getting too old for this. I'm just going to sort of nose and drink a wee bit. So these grain whiskies, they're slightly more akin to the American style whiskies in a sense. Some of the best examples tend to come from ex-bourbon barrels. So they have these sort of lovely vanilla notes coming through, and this is similar. This has got bags of vanilla and spice, and again some sort of nice citrusy notes coming through in this one. Key lime pie and that kind of thing. It's uplifting. Um, on the nose, it's very fresh and vibrant for a whiskey of this age. It's fantastically fresh, and that's I think why I love some of these older grain whiskies because they retain a lot of freshness. and this is just the balance of the style and the wood. They don't get overcome by the wood if they put into the right type of cask. If you put certain grain whiskies into a sherry cask, for example, it would be overrun, and you wouldn't get any of that sort of zestiness, and it might actually the two elements might go against each other and produce something that's kind of dirty in style, but with bourbon barrels or hogsheads. This is from a bourbon barrel. So I'm going to try this. It's got a message coming in from Matthew DeMurray's. Keep rambling. I'm really enjoying the extra info. I may not be reflective of the rest of the audience. So, okay, well, I don't know what to say to that, but thank you very much. 1964, Doug. You're just a youngster. This is from C. James Cook. I'm sorry if any of you are getting bored. All I'm trying to do is give you a little bit of my experience, and we'll crunch through the rest. And that's the nice thing about these tastings. I can't see if you've got up and gone to the toilet or left the room and just got fed up with my ugly face and my voice. But at least if you are, you can run away and you can drink the whiskey later and send me an email or whatever, report back. But anyway, again, down to you in what you get from this whiskey, but it is more towards the sort of bourbon style. Um, Nice vanilla element of hang on. A lot of people say, sort of how long is a finish? Well, a finish is as long as it lasts, but if it's in balance, then that's a good thing. So this is lingering whiskey. Grain whiskies are super value, I find, compared to some of the vintages of single malt whiskey on the market. Right, moving on. We're going back to Glenbergie again. So this is 1989, and it's bottled at 46%. This is, I think it was 29 years old when it was bottled, from memory, but then again, my memory is not as good as it used to be. I just have to keep reactivating my other screen in case. And Todd Ryan saying, quite interesting, Doug. Thanks for the commentary. Right, okay. Ernst Lindout is saying, not bored at all. Ernst, hi to you and Marley. Hope you're doing well, surviving the lockdown. Okay, so Glenbergie, 1989. So you would expect to get some similarities, and if you have kept back a little bit of the 2008 that we tried as number one, then you might be able to benchmark them against each other. And I poured mine into a receptacle on my left, so I'm not able to do that unless I sort of get the sample bottle and sort of pour a little bit more, just to. This to me is interesting because you might be able to pick up some common ground between the two. It's that sort of the fruitiness that comes through. In the 2008, it's young, fresh. You get a lot of sort of toffee caramels coming through now. But it's not a heavyweight, but it's a elegant. If you try to describe it as a, I don't know, a distillery product, I suppose, as a boxer, it'd be a sort of maybe a sort of a light middleweight. And then we tend not to talk too much about age in Berry Brothers because most of us are ancient. We tend to like to talk about maturity of spirit. And the 2008, lovely, vibrant young whiskey. But maturity offers something else. One of the first tasks I had to do when I joined the company was going through some of these old stocks of Speyside whiskey that we had, and I thought I was going to get the sack a couple of months in because I had 400 samples of whiskey delivered to the offices, and I spent 2.5 days tasting through them all. And I found that out of sort of 400 casks, there was only about just less than 100 that were actually worth saving. So they looked good on the books. The accountants loved it because they had increased in value with market rate, but in actual fact, the quality had sort of fallen apart because they'd been left in the wood for too long. So that's the danger. It's about maturity. It's finding the sort of peak of a cask's perfection, so that you're able to say, we can leave this for another sort of 3-4 years. The strength is good, the volume in the cask is good, it's tasting nice in the sample. But if you forget about it, you can leave it for too long, and it will go over the top because the wood becomes too dominant, and sometimes it takes out too much and an extraction, etc., and it just becomes bitter and awful. And that was the sad fact with sort of 3/4 of the stock that I sort of took on to taste when I joined the company all those years ago. So we're very careful about that now, because the last thing we want to do is to destroy good whiskey by letting it go too far in the wood. This one's got some sort of lovely buttery notes to it. It's again, it's almost like a sweet shop. There's coconut and like opening a bag of sweets. Really, it's very confected, gentle on the nose. But beautifully rounded, and you can also get some sort of sort of dollops of honey coming through on the nose. And I'm hoping I'm going to get that on the palate now. Mm. It's actually more virile on the palate. The alcohol cuts through. It's more assertive on the palate than the nose suggests, and I like that because it keeps the whiskey sort of lively, and the alcohol adds a little bit of spice, and there's some natural spice coming through from the fruit notes as well. But I'm still, sort of getting these sort of citrus edges. There's still a bit of coconut. It sort of delivers on the palate pretty much what it has on the nose. And sometimes when you go back and you take a second sip, because your tongue's got used to the alcohol a little bit more. I didn't put any water in this, so I don't really like putting water into some of the older whiskies, even though it would probably make sense, and it's a preference. But anyway, yeah, I mean it's elegant whiskey. I describe it as being elegant. The fruit keeps coming. It's clean. There's a nice balance. There's enough complexity, um, and a sort of lingering spice, and maybe even some sort of slight cardamom notes, that kind of thing coming through from the sort of spicy edge to it. And I love this. So far, my favorite personally of what we've tasted. Uh, It's quite a big statement coming from the guy who blended the Blue Hanger. Anyway, moving on. If let's have a look. question. Multiple people would like to know this 1989 Glenbergie. Why was it bottled at 46%? From the taste, it seems that could have stood cask strength just fine. So there's quite a few messages coming through. Jonathan Flowers says, anyone else getting Japanese pear in bunches? I'm just trying to see which whiskey that related to. I think it's the Invergordon, really. Also getting peppermint and licorice. That goes back to the Invergordon question. So on the 89 Glenbergie, why was it bottled at 46%? We tried to strike a balance in terms of what we bottle at cask strength and what we bottle at 46%. And being a very tight Scotsman, I would show you my wallet. It's about 1 foot thick with receipts going back to 2000, I think. But really, if you have a cask that doesn't have that much liquid in it sometimes, and you think it will suffer reduction down to 46%, the honest truth is you get more bottles. And more bottles, particularly when you have something from 1989, is a good thing. You know, it's not always the way that we do things. You know, a lot of it we'll bottle at cask strength, but you know, 46% the alcohol to me on the 1989 Glenbergie was still sort of fairly pronounced. You know, I could have put a fair bit of water in there and it would have survived it very, very well. So sometimes it goes back to you know, the distillery style, which sometimes is a sort of quite light style in a sense, so the alcohol will come through and deliver more bite. So I think with this one at 46%, it kind of worked for me at the time when I made the decision to do that. And you know, we get small samples delivered from the warehouses in Scotland at our behest, and we just make a decision. Sometimes, you know, in the past we've bottled half a cask at 46% and half a cask at cask strength. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. I'm just about to pour some of this Bunnahabhain 2003. First time I visited Islay, I went to Bunnahabhain, and I made the mistake. There was Bunnahabhain basically had a small village built around it by the workers for the workers at the distillery, and they're still occupied. One or two are kind of you know, sort of owned by the distillery still, and that they'll, you know, put up visitors occasionally. And I was lucky enough to be in that camp at the time. But I bumped into a lovely lady who lived in one of the cottages, and I said, "What a lovely morning to be at Bunnahabhain." And she looked at me and she went, "It's Bunnahabhain, dear boy, Bunnahabhain." So from that day onwards, I've always been very careful, just in case I bump into her again or she tries to bump me off. But I think she was well into her 80s, and this is going back 25 years or so. So if she's still alive, then I'll drink some Bunnahabhain to her. Bunnahabhain translates from Gaelic or Old Scots, whatever you want to call it. It just means mouth of the river. Bunna being bottom, and you know, Haven being haven or harbour. And the river in question is the Margadale, which is the Bunnahabhain's one of the two distilleries that faces across to Jura, across the Sound of Jura, the Sound of Islay. The other distillery is Carrila, which means the Sound of Islay. And if somebody put a pistol to my head and said, "What's your favourite whiskey?" then my favourite whiskey would be Kalila, as long as you get the right cask and the right maturity. So that just in case anyone asks the question, um, uh, that's my favourite. But Bunnahabhain has long been a favourite. I remember as a younger person visiting the warehouses there that were full of casks with Berry Brothers and Wright on the end of the cask, and that's because quite a lot of it went into the Cutty Sark, our blend at the time, and up until probably the 1960s, mid 1960s to late 1960s, Bunnahabhain was actually a sort of fairly peaty whiskey. And in recent years, as we sort of found out from the blue hanger you tasted with the Bunnahabhain Moyne, they've been producing more batches of more heavily peated stock that they market as Moyne or Margadale or Stoisha nowadays, three sort of local names. But this is the 2003 is the unpeated style, and this is out of a sherry butt. And the first thing I get when I nose it is this kind of stewed fruits. There's prune-like influence from the sherry cask. This was 2003 distillate, bottled at 46%. Again, same rationale. This would have been a bigger cask, and Islay whiskey is in higher demand. So if we can get more bottles, we'll get more bottles. It means more profit for us and more bottles to go around, and some of it to come back to me so I can enjoy it again, which is lovely. Thank you very much. There is also a sort of custody note to me underneath the sort of stewed prune. And some people like this sort of sherry cask influence, and some people don't. Sometimes it's completely overpowering. But to me, this is within my limitations. There's even a sort of somehow a hint of wet dog. I'm just looking to see if the dog's come into the room. So maybe a slightly sort of seaweedy note to it. But anyway, that's just me, and I prefer you to make your own minds up as ever. So let's have a look. Roberto Sakura says, "You've got me with your honesty, very rare amongst bottlers." Well, thank you very much, Roberto. But there's only one way to do something, and that's the right way, as far as I'm concerned. So, cheers. Right. Yeah. So, what I suspected might be too dominant on the nose with this, with the stewed fruits, the pruny notes, dates, figs, that sort of thing, concentrate. Actually, on the palate, it's very well balanced because the whiskey has a sort of strong texture to it, and it sort of has enough glue to hold everything together, and it balances everything out really nicely on the palate, and the acidity start to actually get some sort of slight apple freshness coming down into the side of the mouth, which is where your sort of receptors are that will pick up more acidity. But it's juicy, it's fresh, it's lively. I think it's a lovely whiskey, and I'm not going to pour this one away. I'm going to maybe save a bit of this for later, if I don't spill it all on myself. So I just have half of it. Mm. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah. Uh, right. Okay. So we move on, and the last whiskey in this lineup is actually the least expensive. It's our Isla Reserve, and the only reason that I sort of saved the cheapest until last is that it's the one that packs the most punch in terms of delivering that keynote of sort of Isla pungency, the sort of the deep phenols, peatiness, everything that reflects the island style. And that's really what I was trying to do when the company asked me to create something that was more a sort of a regional expression. Then obviously it's natural that Isla is obviously a region island of, I think nowadays 9 distilleries, maybe a tenth on the way. Um, and they're not all the same. The Bunnahabhain, not the peatiest. At the top end, you've got expressions from Bruichladdich, Port Charlotte, which are very high phenol exposure, and obviously the likes of Ardbeg and Lefroy, Lagavulin, with more of a kind of sherry edge by the time it sort of poured from the bottle. Um, and I mentioned earlier my favourite distillery of all the Scots whiskey distilleries is Kalila. Got a love for that. Um, and From blending this, we use some of our stocks of Stoisha, which is the peated Bunnahabhain, and we use some stocks of Kalila. Um, and there's a lot of people who just love the Isla style, as I do. But I think the important thing with any whiskey is to try to keep balance, um, and that it needs to have other things there. You need to have other elements that come in that sort of develop, the things I talked about earlier: balance, complexity, texture. You need those things in any whiskey to make it a good whiskey. And this retails, sort of probably, I don't know, somewhere around €35. But it's got some of our most precious casks, and it was, put together carefully, even though it's only two different whiskies. Uh, you actually sort of hand select the casks that you draw out to create the balance. So, it could be sort of 30, 40 casks at a time. Um, some of the sister casks, they might not have been ready yet, so you hold them back. So it really is still handcrafted, even though it's a blended malt whiskey. So see what you think. It's, to me, it's got those sort of meaty sort of phenols coming through. It's something that reminds me a little bit of sort of new leather, that kind of thing. Yeah, sort of leather workshop. Some slightly tarry notes. I wouldn't say it's pure oceanic in the way that some Isla whiskies can be, with a lot of saltiness. But the phenol is very heavy. It's not so much the sort of tarry ropes on harbours and quaysides that people describe of Isla whiskey, but it's got some of the sort of diesel fumes from the fishing boats, for me anyway. And on the palate, there's a creaminess to it. You'll get to. I'm going to try some now, and then I'll look at some of your messages again. So either you like the Isla style or you don't. And if you do, you should like this. I mean, it's a younger age profile, obviously, um, but at the same time, importantly for me, I think it delivers what it should do in terms of reflecting kind of what you think of the island. So it's almost like saying to a blind person, go and paint your vision of Isla, which may be a sort of good or a bad way of looking at it, but in flavor profile, that's my sort of answer to what we have available as a company to be able to deliver that. And we're sort of quite a small company in terms of spirits. We're not the smallest independent bottler, but we're nowhere like a Diageo or Edrington or any of the big firms. So we have what we have, and we try to do the best we can from the cash that we own. And to me, that's it's a privilege and at the same time a challenge. But it's very enjoyable challenge, and to be able to share some of that with you good people this evening. I hope you enjoyed what you've tasted. I'm just going to sort of have a look and see if I can answer some questions because there's a few coming through now. So Brian van der Meer, ginger in the finish with the Bunnahabhain. Yep, I entirely agree with that. Yeah, not much more I can say to that, but I entirely agree with you. It does have that, yeah, the ginger coming through, especially on the finish. Uh, uh, Ledone Emmerich, and I hope I've got you pronounced your name right. Uh, I was not a Bunner lover. This one changes my mind. Okay, well that's good. The thing about whiskey is that there's predominant distillery style, but every cask is different. You can meet people from the same family, and you might not like one of them, but you might get on well with the other. So this is the world of exploration, and just getting to know whiskies the way that we all get to know each other. So it's nice that you changed your mind a little bit on that. And then Jesper Antonsen, he says Buna is by far the best so far. Um, okay, good. Uh, and Vincent, things are jumping around because you're all asking questions, so keep tuning in. Uh, that's all right. Where are we? Jesper says Buna's far the best so far. Vincent says, Doug, is there a set formula for this one? One batch or something that's repeated? So I think you're probably referring to the classic range Isla blended malt, uh, and basically the answer is we have what we have as a company in terms of casks, and I'm trying to sort of give the Isla semblance, the Isla style, but the recipe could change, from batch to batch. And it's about managing our stock to make sure that we've got enough to produce enough of this, but also we obviously we have to hold back casks to be bottled at older age as single casks. And then uh, C. James Cook says, peated in a glove does not hit you over the head. Very nice. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about just having that sort of balance of something else going on in the whiskey. So it doesn't need to be sort of the hammer of peat on your head. You need the sort of honey strands, and you need the maturity to come through in the whiskey, really, and other fruity elements just to make it enjoyable. And Matthew de Morris says, we would love to see a version of this, but at a higher price and quality mark, or like a £60 blended Isla. Well, I'll work on it. you know, we have other projects as a company. We're looking into a step up from this range, but it's sometimes difficult to convince people about blended malt whiskey or even blends. Because I love blending, I love blends, I love the experimentation, but the market is largely driven by single malt, and if we have older ages of Isla stock, um, by and large, that's what we're going to bottle those as and for. But if we have the opportunity, then it's something we'll look into. So you might get your wish. So thank you for that. And then Isabella Cameron says, great selection. Thanks, Doug. And Jesper again, thanks for an interesting tasting. For me, the Bunna was the best. Greetings from Denmark, and greetings back to Denmark from United Kingdom. Uh, George Geist says, great to see you again, dear sir. Many thanks. Well, I hope to see you in the flesh at some point, uh, not too distant. I'm really missing people a lot, and this is really important for me. Just even though I can't see you guys, people, people, the most important thing. Without people, you can make whiskey, and without whiskey, you don't meet as many people. uh, and then Nuno Pimentel uh, is saying, hang on, sorry, this is skipping around a little bit as feeds come in. Excellent tasting, Doug. Well, thanks. It's down to the whiskey. It's not down to me. It's down to you guys because you're whiskey fans, and whiskey fans are the best people in the world. And Benjamin Willis. This will stop jumping around. Blue Hanger was my favourite. Looking forward to getting a bottle. Well, we still have it, so you can get it. Tie between this is from Elfie. Tie between Blue Hanger and Bunnahabhain for me, both very different. Yeah. Hansel says many thanks, Doug. Quicksilver says thank you, Doug. Amazon says Minotaurus Frost. Minotaurus Frost. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it says many thanks, Doug. And Evald Bruges. I hope I pronounced your name properly. Thanks, Doug. Great story. And I'm going to close off at this point. Thank you very, very much, folks. Do come and visit us in London when you're able to, and carry on enjoying the good stuff. That's the important thing in life, and just look after yourselves. Uh, Salutations. Okay, I'm hanging up now, so have a nice evening.